Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we've got a tale of two ancient superpowers. We're talking about two empires that both conquered the known world, but, and this is the key, with wildly different results. So we're going to dig into a really fascinating historical puzzle here. You've got the Assyrians and the Persians. Both managed to pull off this incredible feat of unifying a totally fractured world. But one of them lasted over 3 times longer than the other. So why? What was their secret? The answer, it turns out, tells us something really fundamental about power, something that's just as true today as it was way back then. All right, first things first, let's set the stage. Before these massive empires came along, the ancient Near East was, well, a total patchwork of rival kingdoms and competing cultures. It was a world that was pretty much always in conflict. I mean, just try to picture it. You had this mosaic of powerful, totally distinct civilizations. We're talking Egypt, the city-states of Mesopotamia, the Hittite Empire, the list goes on. Each one had its own gods, its own language, its own unique identity. The idea of uniting all of them under a single banner, it seemed, well, basically impossible. It would take a level of power nobody had ever seen before. So who were the first ones to actually pull this off? The Assyrians. They did it. But their method for holding it all together, it was built on one thing, and one thing only: absolute, overwhelming military might and just sheer terror. Their strategy was, well, it was simple and it was brutal. The thinking was, if people won't obey you willingly, then you make them fear you into submission. For the Assyrians, all that diversity wasn't a strength. Nope, it was a threat, and a threat that had to be stamped out completely. And this whole philosophy, it translated directly into how they ran things. The Assyrians systematically went about crushing local identities. We're talking entire populations getting uprooted and forcibly moved just to break their will to resist. And the wealthy, the influential, the potential troublemakers, they were dragged off to the capital, Nineveh, and put into forced labor. You can probably guess what happened next. This created this deep, simmering resentment that just bubbled under the surface everywhere. So, after all that brutal conquest, all that terror, how long did this empire built on fear actually last? Get this, barely 50 years. That's it. For all their military genius, their whole reign of terror was surprisingly short. Yeah, the very fear they used as a weapon to control everyone, it ended up being the fuel for their own destruction. The empire didn't just fade away. No, it violently shattered under the weight of its own cruelty. It just broke apart, splintering into 4 new kingdoms. But out of the ashes of Assyria's spectacular failure, a new power started to rise. And this was a power that had been watching what happened, and more importantly, it had been learning. Enter the Achaemenid Persians, named for their founding dynasty. They stepped right onto the world stage, and they faced the exact same problem. How in the world do you rule over dozens and dozens of different cultures? Except for them, the challenge was even bigger. They ended up conquering a territory that included not just the old Assyrian lands, but also the 4 kingdoms that had sprung up after it fell.
So this brings us to the big question, right? How did they succeed where the Assyrians had failed so spectacularly? What was their blueprint for building something that would actually last?
And when you look at their approaches side by side, the difference is just striking. The Persians looked at what the Assyrians did, and instead of repeating those mistakes, they chose a completely different path. They swapped brute force for tolerance. They replaced forced assimilation with local autonomy. See, their goal wasn't to subjugate the world. It was to integrate it. This was really their core bargain. The message they sent to the peoples they conquered was basically this: live how you want, keep your gods, keep your customs. We are not going to interfere. In return, just pay your taxes and stay loyal. It was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time, offering respect in exchange for tribute. And their genius wasn't just about policy. It was about infrastructure. They built the famous Royal Road, a massive highway that literally connected their huge, diverse empire from one end to the other. And this road wasn't just for moving armies around. It was an economic artery. It meant messengers could travel fast, it kicked off trade between far-flung regions, and it really helped create a shared feeling of being part of one big, connected network. And, the results, they really speak for themselves. You've got 50 years for the Assyrian hammer versus 200 years for the Persian network. It's pretty clear which model worked better. The Persian way of building a tolerant, connected empire was just so much more stable, so much more enduring. And this whole philosophy, it wasn't just some abstract idea they talked about. No, it was something the Persians literally carved into the stone of their capital city for the entire world to see. Let's talk about Persepolis. This was their ceremonial capital, and it wasn't just a fancy place for the king to live. It was basically a piece of political propaganda in stone. The entire city was designed to send a very specific message. And if you look closely at the carvings on the walls, you won't see conquered enemies being crushed underfoot. You see something completely different. These incredible carvings, they show delegations from every single corner of the empire. You've got Lydians, Egyptians, Babylonians, all walking together. And they're bringing gifts, not as beaten down enemies, but as respected members of a huge community. The art itself reinforces the central idea of the empire, that this whole thing was a collaborative project, a gathering of nations. But of course, history is never quite that simple, is it? No empire lasts forever. And so, after 2 centuries of remarkable stability, the great Achaemenid Persian Empire also met its end. It was conquered by a new, unstoppable military force led by none other than Alexander the Great. So, where does that leave us? What's the real takeaway here? Well, the story of Assyria and Persia kind of presents us with a fundamental choice. Do you build with a hammer, or do you build with a network? Do you rule through force, or do you rule through cooperation? One path is fast and brutal. The other is patient and ultimately much more resilient. And what history seems to be telling us is that while fear can definitely build an empire, it seems only respect can make it truly last. Which kind of leaves us with a question for today, right? What are we building, and which tools are we choosing to use?